part of our meeting, our first panel. And for this first webinar, a number of leading academics have shared their recent writings and publications to inform the discussion. First of all, I am very pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. He studied in Harvard until he got also his PhD. He was a professor in Harvard and now in Columbia. He has been working really closely and actively on the Millennium Goals, on the SDGs. He's a strong advocate on climate change, on fighting poverty. I think he's a great example on how we translate very good ideas into very good actions. Thank you very much, Dr. Sachs. You have the floor.
Gabriella, thank you so much. I'm really delighted with the seminar today, and I want to thank all of the parliamentarians, and of course IPU and the Parliamentarians for Global Goals and the Parliamentarians for Global Action. I think this should be routine, actually, if I may say so, that parliamentarians meet in webinars around the world routinely to discuss issues like this. I also hope that parliaments increasingly also meet online, especially when they can't meet in person, but that the epidemic should not stop the work of parliaments, but rather parliamentary work could, to a significant extent, move effectively online as necessary. I just find this an important way to maintain a global dialogue, which is more important than ever. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the epidemic itself. We are still in a desperate situation regarding the epidemic. It's not over by any means. It is actually accelerating in many parts of the world. Lauren, I don't know if you got my slides and can show them. I thought I would just go through a few quick points. If you could go to the next slide, please. If we look at the number of, this is actually confirmed cases per million, what we can see is that the world is very different in how this epidemic is hitting right now. The countries of the Asia Pacific, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the countries of the ASEAN region, by and large, are containing or suppressing this epidemic. We should learn from the Asia Pacific countries. They have been by far the most successful countries in stopping the pandemic. The pandemic began in China, of course, but is spread quickly to the rest of the world. China got it under control first through a very strict quarantine policy, and it suppressed the epidemic. It took it very seriously. China's neighbors got the epidemic under control. In Europe and the United States and now South America, no. This turned into really a public health disaster that continues. If you go to the next slide, please. These are the deaths per million population. You can see once again, there's a huge difference in the death rates around the world. The Asia Pacific region, once again, has kept the deaths quite low, usually to something around 5 per million population. In Western Europe, unfortunately, the death rates are in the hundreds per million. In the United States, several hundred per million, more than 110,000 people dead of COVID. All of the Americas now, North America and South America, are in a very deep crisis with massive deaths. This is a failure of governance in the Western Hemisphere that's extremely serious. What one can see in both this slide and the previous slide is that in Africa and in South Asia, the case is still relatively low, but the epidemic is starting to expand quickly. So one of the reasons why cases in Africa and in South Asia are fewer per million population is that the virus arrived several weeks later, and these countries are now battling. Will it go the way of Europe and the Americas, out of control, at least for many weeks, or will it be suppressed as in the Asia Pacific region? Next. If one looks at the number of cases per day, you can see on this logarithmic scale, it's a little hard to see, but Brazil and India have significant rise in cases. Brazil is probably the worst crisis in the world right now because the epidemic is rising quickly and because the president is a disaster, I'm sorry to say. But I think it's important to just speak plainly when it comes to these issues, because Bolsonaro's lack of knowledge, his populism, his neglect of science is killing Brazilians in large numbers. And this is really a tragedy. We have the same experience in the United States. Donald Trump is an incompetent and has utterly neglected the most basic public health measures. And the result is we have 110,000 Americans dead, and the deaths continue to rise at 1,000 per day or more. And this is the lack of leadership that is so troubling. As parliamentarians, my first message to you is you need leadership, national, clear leadership to suppress the epidemic, to stop the deaths, to understand how dangerous this disease is. And in places like my country and in Brazil and in Mexico and in other places, the leadership is not there right now. And the result is suffering and deaths. And I think that this is absolutely the most important basic point of this epidemic. It is controllable. That's what the Asia Pacific region is demonstrating, but it is not being controlled in many places. Next, please.
Jeff, did you also maybe want to turn on your camera? I don't know if it's not working on your computer, just a note.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay. How did the Asia Pacific region control the epidemic? Very, very quickly. It stopped travel from the high-risk regions first. Next slide. People used hygienic behavior. This is a graph that's very hard to see, but the red lines are from the Asia Pacific region. The purple lines at the bottom are from Europe. And what this is a proportion of the population using face masks. So in the Asia Pacific, people took on face masks early on. Proper hygiene. Whereas in Europe and the United States, people said, oh, this doesn't involve us. This isn't our problem. And of course, the result was massive numbers of deaths. So the Asia Pacific region was just smarter and more hygienic and more preventative from the start. Whereas in my country, Donald Trump, being the fool that he is, unfortunately, told people wearing a face mask, that's not your freedom. So he gave everyone the freedom to die. He told them, oh, don't wear face masks. I'm not going to wear a face mask. And the result is 110,000 deaths. So this is just being smart in Asia, wear face masks, being stupid in my country. And it's a warning to other countries, please take care of yourselves. This is extremely important, and it makes a very big difference in controlling the epidemic. Next slide. This is another graph asking people about other hygiene, other personal behavior like hand washing. Again, the Asian Pacific countries just have better hygiene, so they were able to stop the epidemic faster. And this, I think, is also important. Next slide. This is testing policy. The East Asian and Pacific countries got started in testing earlier. This is testing at the end of February. All of these data are publicly available online. I'm using a data set here called Our World in Data. But the point is, the way to stop this epidemic is through good hygiene of wearing face masks, physical distancing, hand washing, hand sanitizers, and testing and tracing people so that the infected people are isolated or quarantined. These are the two basic important ways to stop the epidemic: public health measures for hygiene and to isolate infected individuals. And Asia Pacific did this early, and Europe and the United States did not do this, and now South America is not doing it properly either. And a lot depends on the leadership, because if the leadership is clear and strong, then the public understands. If the leadership is populist and telling lies and irresponsible like Donald Trump, then you end up with a mass epidemic. Next slide, please. So this is contact tracing. Every country should have extensive contact tracing. What does contact tracing mean? It means that every symptomatic person is quickly tested. If they are tested positive, they are quarantined or isolated. All of their close contacts are tested through teams that call or physically visit those who have been infected. Better to call these days or online, and then trace the close contacts, the colleagues, the family members, the friends, so that those people can be tested quickly too. This is systemic control. And again, you can see in Brazil, no tracing because of Bolsonaro. You can see in the United States, limited tracing because of Trump. So in blue is the comprehensive tracing. That you can see is the Asia Pacific region, where this epidemic has been kept under control. Next slide, please. Oh, one before that, yes. So in this survey that I've been referring to, people are asked, do you trust your government? Is the government handling the crisis well? And the countries at the top, if you look all the way to the right, it's the most current day. Countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, there the people are saying we trust our government because they're doing a good job in controlling the epidemic. If you go towards the bottom of this sample, there's the United States doing a terrible job. Sweden, not a very good job, I'm afraid. And I have seen Sweden's policy from the beginning, and I was not in favor or impressed with it. It was too lax from the start. It let too much, it did not take this epidemic seriously enough, in my opinion. But the point is, people know the difference of good governance and poor governance. And the good governance is in the Asia Pacific region right now. The epidemic is stopped. The death rates are very low. The hygiene levels very high. The contact tracing very high. The control on travel very high. In Europe, the United States, and Latin America, poor performance by and large, and both by the public and by the governments. And in Africa and in South Asia and Central Asia, the battle is on right now, because this epidemic could easily get out of control, and it would be devastating for these societies. Notice that I have not mentioned the shutdowns very much. Let me just say a word about shutting down the economy. The only reason to shut down the economy is because you're not doing the public health measures. So shutting down the economy is costly. It's a necessary step when there's inadequate public health measures of testing, tracing, quarantining, and proper hygienic behavior, all countries should stop large gatherings of people in any event, large entertainment festivals, large sports events, large religious events. This is very dangerous because they are called super spreader events where hundreds or thousands of people become infected in one event. So that should be stopped, period. But it's not necessary to close the economy if there is public health control. And this, I think, is what is the most decisive point. Shutting the economy is a necessary short-term measure in many places, but scaling up the public health control is essential. Now, finally, and I'll just close here, our topic is the SDGs and the SDGs after the epidemic. I want to stress we are not going to achieve the SDGs unless we stop the epidemic. That's why I have focused my remarks on stopping the epidemic, because the recovery comes after stopping the epidemic, and we're not there yet. I have a lot I would say about how we should recover in a green, sustainable, inclusive recovery. But if we don't stop the epidemic, we're going to have a global disaster. And so public health right now is by far the highest priority. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sachs. Indeed, you're absolutely right. If we do not prioritize people's health, it is going to be very difficult to prioritize the planet's needs. So we need to work together to control this pandemic and, of course, to rebuild literally our planet. We cannot conceive a new normality if we are not even achieving health for all. Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful remarks, as always. Now I would like to introduce Mr. Gao Juning. Dr. Juning Gao is an associate professor at School of Public Policy and Management, an associate researcher at Institute for Contemporary China Studies, Tsinghua University. He holds a PhD in land economy for the University of Cambridge, Master of Management and Bachelor of Engineering from Tsinghua University. He was elected the president of Chinese Economics Association, Europe, UK, the standing board member of the Committee of Social and Economic System Engineering of the Society of System Engineering of China, and he also serves as the associate editor of Structural Change and Economic Dynamics. He also served as visiting professor at Graduate School of Economics, Nagoya University, and honorary associate professor at the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management, University College of London. Dr. Gao's main research fields include international economics and international development, resource and environmental economics and policy. The courses he taught includes joint PhD course, International Development and Global Governance, Economic Theory 2, and Master course, Economic Development and Policy of China, which was awarded Excellent Graduate Course of Tsinghua University and Model English Course of Ministry of Education for overseas students. He was awarded first grade in the 10th Beijing Teaching Skill Competition of junior faculties of higher education institutions and first grade of 2015 Beijing Excellent Achievement Award in project consultation. Dr. Gao was also nominated White Chair Associate Professor of Tsinghua University in 2019. Thank you very much, Professor Juning, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So it is my great honor to have the chance to share our observation on China's policy response to the impact of COVID-19, especially under the understanding of SDG on this very excellent platform of IPU and SDSN. And I would like to thank Professor Sachs especially for inviting me to share my point of view again. to better help all the participants to better understand China's policy response. So maybe please next slide, please. As China is the first country that was heavily impacted by the COVID-19, so now maybe when we try to trace an economy who can recover from this pandemic, maybe China is also a typical case. For example, if you use this so-called Financial Times China Economic Activity Index, you may see that China's economic activity has already recovered to roughly 80% of the benchmark day. That's the 1st of January up to 2020. Maybe compare with the same day, early June of last year, I think roughly 90% of the economic activities are recovered. So you can see on the left-hand side, I actually list, you can treat it the cycle of the impact of the pandemic and its recovery. So roughly we need 2 quarters to gradually recover from this serious, let's say, COVID-19 epidemic. So next slide, please. So inside this index, maybe we can have a deep observation. So next slide, please. That as a whole, roughly speaking, the economic activity recovered to 90%. So would you please turn to next slide? Yeah, thank you very much. But let's say if you go, sorry, the previous one. It goes a little further. Okay, sorry. Actually, it's still just the second one. Yeah, this one. Yeah, thank you very much. So you can see if you go to check the, the previous one, the detailed component of the index. Yeah, I think a very impressive fact is that the air pollution of China, especially in the area around Beijing, its capital city, actually down to roughly 80% of the same day in last year. So it also, I read a lot of studies saying that, roughly speaking, the first quarter, China's carbon dioxide emission also, decreased roughly 17%. So although it is not an expected carbon mitigation, but that actually gives us, let's say, a space to think about how the human activity can impact onto the climate change and, let's say, air pollution. And this chart, this table shows us that China has already experienced a deep V in the first quarter of its economic growth. China's GDP growth experienced a negative 6.8% in the first quarter. So that's the first quarterly negative growth during the past 4 decades. So after, let's say, Mr. Deng Xiaoping opening up China's door to the outside world, so this is for the first time. And inside all the sectors, you may also see that a lot of sectors, just like the accommodation, catering, and all these, actually, they have negative growth for roughly 30-35%, something like that. So next slide, please. So actually, the effort of Chinese policymakers would like to not only maintain its economic growth. You can see also till very recently, only till April and May, China's total export gradually into positive growth, and also its exportation growth has experienced a positive growth in April. So that means, after the whole quarter of the pandemic, that means the economic activity has gradually recovered. I think that's maybe, a time cycle for many economies who actually have experienced an epidemic and recover from that shock. So now many indicators of China are still in active growth, but actually you can see the negative growth is not narrowing compared with previous months. So next slide, please. Actually, we are on the platform working together with IPU. So actually, I here would like to introduce, this is actually our parliamentary, our National People's Congress has just, closed 2 weeks ago. And the government work report from our Prime Minister, Mr. Li Keqiang, has already announced for the first time that China will not set a target for economic growth, no GDP target for this time, but only target for employment. So you can see now the new target is that they still claim that we should create an extra, a new job position, roughly 9 million for the urban area. Because in the previous year, annually, the target yearly 10 million to up to 13 million. So at the same time, we also want to cap the unemployment rate at a relative low level. Although 6% maybe seems not that high, but consider that in the past years, China's unemployment rate is usually, especially the survey rate is usually just roughly 4% or 5%. So now it's already relative high. But overall speaking, is that you can see our parliamentary now shift our targeting system, because several decades before this year, every year in our government work report, we will set a target of our GDP growth. But this is actually for the first time, we didn't set up the GDP target, but only the employment target. And the policy to facilitate, to realize, facilitate the realizing of these targets, you can see we summarize our policy as 2 1 trillion and 2 half trillion. 2 1 trillion means first, we actually extend the fiscal deficit, an extra trillion yuan fiscal deficit, and now to 6.3% of GDP. And especially China will issuing another 1 trillion yuan special purpose treasury bond, actually to raise enough fund for the government to fight against this epidemic. Besides that, we also have, we call that another 2 half trillion policy. One is we're now lowering the value-added tax rate and corporate social security rate, and that can roughly save 500 billion yuan to the small and medium enterprises. And besides that, the central bank also offers another 500 billion yuan as more quota to refinancing and rediscount to support small and micro enterprises. So this is actually the main policy. So next slide, please. And the main target of all these policy is that we want to guarantee the employment, especially the employment for small and micro enterprises. So here, I think these are all efforts linked to the SDGs, including the poverty alleviation, to offering decent jobs and economic growth, and also reduce the inequality. Why is that? It's because China's small and micro enterprises, they are actually struggling when they are experiencing this epidemic, because they are actually in a shortage of cash flow. They are on the edge of bankruptcy. So they are experiencing a difficult time, but they are actually the main body of the employment all around China. So now you can see the hot topic on China's newspaper during the past several days is that now, the government is on the contrary encouraging the small and micro enterprises or the small business to sell their products on a street stall. Because that was actually prohibited several years ago, but now it was actually encouraged, even by the Prime Minister. And on the left-hand side, I actually attached an advertisement in Chinese. Sorry, that's in Chinese, but actually I would like to introduce the content of that advertisement. That is an advertisement that an online fresh food delivery platform, they have a nickname called Mr. Hippo. That was a platform under Alibaba. They actually directly directly hire a lot of employers from, a lot of restaurants offline to directly, work for these online platforms. They don't have to deliver their CV to this platform again. They don't have to have, interviewing again. But all of them can directly go to this online platform, we call them Mr. Hippo, to do the service for the fresh food delivery. So this is actually create a new model for to offer a decent job. We call that sharing employment. You don't have to do to deliver the CV or the interview yourself, but actually you can see all the employment of a group of restaurants are directly hired by the online platform. So maybe in the future, maybe we just work for a platform, but we don't know who we work for, or maybe we can work for one company in the morning, but work for another company in the afternoon. So that's maybe a new possibility. Okay, so next slide, please. But all these efforts, from my perspective, is that this is the basic human rights, because we want to have people to at least have a decent job, have at least enough money to take care of their family. Besides that, you can see now China is also delivering consumption coupons. And why I listed here is that maybe I think for most people's sense is that we should have the largest amount of consumption coupon in Hubei province, because they are the province most seriously damaged by COVID-19. But actually here you can see on the top is a province called Zhejiang. And why they can deliver, they can issue the largest amount of consumption coupon, because actually Zhejiang province is the headquarters of Alibaba. So actually this province is the only one whose fiscal revenue experienced a positive growth in the first quarter. All other provinces are experiencing a negative growth. Only they have the capacity to issue more consumption coupon to encouraging their citizens to have more consumption. So you can see here in the McKinsey survey that China already belongs to the group of economy whose consumers has a relative positive expectation on their future, on their consumption in the future. So this is maybe anyway. And the last slide I would like to have, so next slide please, is that Chinese government now trying to encourage the so-called new infrastructure. So next slide, please. Okay. So what does the new infrastructure means is that now not only the giant state-owned enterprises, but also the big private business like Huawei, like ZTE, all these guys are encouraged. Oh, sorry, the previous slide, please. Are highly encouraged to invest a large amount of money into the so-called new infrastructure, like the ICT, like the 5G telecommunication, industrial internet, big data center, artificial intelligence, and also even for the vehicle charging pile, and also let's say even the education infrastructure, especially because we are all now teaching online, so we also need a massive new amount of education infrastructure. So I think all these actually link to our realization of several other goals in SDGs. No doubt it linked to the industrial innovation and infrastructure, but it will also help with China to get better education capacity, and also renewable energy, and also sustainable city urban consumption, and all other, even the public-private partnership. So this is actually, I think, based on my observation, that China's main policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic during the past, let's say, several months, and that many of them, I have to say, they are actually deeply integrated with China's, target to try to realize its sustainable development goals. So that's actually my main observations. And thank you again, all of you again, to giving me this opportunity to share my view and point. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Gao. It has been a wonderful explanation of what China is doing to control the pandemic, but also to take care of something very important, our jobs and salaries. I would like only to underline very fast that the vice president of the executive committee of the IPU is from China, and they are doing a wonderful, wonderful work in SDGs seminars and awareness and a lot of information for parliamentarians. So thank you very much also for China in that regard. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Martin Muhleisen. Martin is the Director of Strategy, Policy and Review Department of the IMF. In this capacity, he led the work of the IMF strategic direction and the design, implementation, and evaluation of fund policies. He also oversees the IMF's interactions with international bodies, such as the G20 and the United Nations. Prior to his current position, Mr. Muhleisen was Chief of Staff to Christine Lagarde, the IMF's Managing Director. His tenure coincided with the completion of the 14th Quarter Review, the negotiation of new IMF programs with Ukraine and Greece, as well as the IMF rapid test of the African Ebola crisis. He has wonderful biographical information, but in order to give more time to our questions and answers with the parliamentarians, because we want this to be an interactive dialogue, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Muhleisen, and again, my apologies, but I would like to have more interaction with the parliamentarians. Thank you, Doctor. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and you're quite right. And thanks for inviting me to this important event. Let me speak maybe perhaps about the broad issues of the global economy and then turn to the specific implications for the SDGs. So you all mentioned already the unprecedented challenge that we're facing with this crisis. And so far, we've also seen an unprecedented policy response. It's been differentiated between different groups of countries. The larger, wealthier countries had more space. Their central banks have thrown a lot of liquidity at the economy, and there were huge fiscal packages, including, as we just heard, in China, that have kind of tried to minimize the fallout from the crisis. However, of course, as you know, the outlook has been quite downgraded a lot, and we're still seeing how this will play out. Emerging markets and low-income countries have had less space to expand policies, but if you look, for example, at the IMF's policy tracker that's on our website that lists the measures taken by our member countries, you'll see that they also have responded quite forcefully within their means to kind of support the economy and most of all finance the health response. And countries have taken quite unprecedented and unorthodox policy measures, including in countries that so far have been rather traditional. And it's been important to really step up and fight this crisis along all fronts, as Jeff has noted in his introduction. It is really a health crisis, and to get back into some kind of normalcy on the economic situation, we need to fight the health crisis. Now, as I mentioned, the outlook is subject to extraordinary risks. The stock market and financial markets have, of course, rebounded and have stabilized because of the central bank reaction, but there's a lot that is still to come. If you look at trade data, at export data, at the demand for example, products from low-income countries, commodity demands, it's all still fairly low, and there's still a large uphill battle to be fought. Now, what is needed, and where can you as parliamentarians come in? First of all, the financing. There is a huge financing need out there, both domestically still for many sectors, but also internationally. The international financial institutions, including my own one, the IMF, are trying to mobilize as much funding as we can. For example, let me just mention Africa. There's a financing need identified of more than 100 billion alone for this year. We're trying to provide up to about 15 to 20 billion probably during this year with our instruments. By comparison, our concessional lending to Africa in the past has averaged around 3 billion a year perhaps. So really trying to step up, and so are other international institutions. At the same time, other forms of mobilizing liquidity consists of postponing debt payments. And you may have heard about a joint debt initiative of our managing director and David Malpass, the president of the World Bank. That is now effective. China has just again reaffirmed its participation in this initiative yesterday. And we're seeing now countries applying and receiving relief from debt payments to official bilateral creditors. And this initiative, if there's a need, and I'm sure there will be more need, is set to be extended into the next year, pending, of course, a G20 decision on that one. We've also tried to issue SDRs, general SDR issue that would help especially poorer and developing countries. We didn't have the necessary support at the IMF to do this, but we are exploring ways for countries to donate or pool their SDRs in support of countries that need this kind of liquidity. And that is where parliamentarians such as you could come in, to the extent that you can support the work of international institutions, to the extent that you can provide development assistance to country in need. I think your support and your leadership is very much needed at this point. Financing, I mentioned as the first policy measure. Second is how to deal with debt. And that is both a domestic issue, corporate debt and government debt, but it is also an international issue. It is a cross-border debt in foreign currency that is burdensome for many countries. It's both the private sector and the public sector. And while we do have tools to deal with debt where it is unsustainable, it is the sheer magnitude at this point and the sheer number of cases that will weigh on us going forward. As you may have noticed, emerging markets and low-income countries have had some success in getting back to markets. There's been very strong differentiation according to countries' fundamentals and policies, but there will probably be a number of countries where the return to markets will not be assured and where the debt burden will be unsustainable. So how to deal with this large-scale number of cases potentially requires a rethink of how to involve the private sector, how to bring in countries that are not represented in the Paris Club at the moment to participate in these debt workouts. And we need to think very hard about strengthening the international debt architecture. That is something that is already imminent in some cases where the IMF is prevented from lending. We only can lend where that is sustainable, but it will become a bigger issue as we go down and the recovery is slow to come back, and countries will experience difficulties. Now, the third point I'd like to make, and we've already kind of heard it to some extent on the Sustainable Development Goals. Here, the crisis, in some sense, provides an opportunity because, as every crisis does, it accelerates the change in the structure of an economy. Companies that, or countries that had a weak or unsustainable business model will see that this business model will have to be replaced by something new. And the need for continued strong fiscal spending in many countries to sustain the economy also provides an opportunity to rethink what the money is spent on. And some examples from China were on infrastructure and technology. And that is something that, again, US parliamentarians will have to consider going forward. It is a chance to direct public funds more into green investments, more into new forms of technology. The working from home and the greater use of technology and mobile technology has shown us a way forward. And in a sense, we should not waste this opportunity, even though, of course, we're still mired in the crisis. But looking forward, it is really important to make sure that the economy that comes out of this crisis is a more sustainable and a better economy in some sense. What it also requires is that we need to think about, that is more perhaps for developing countries and emerging markets, is what do countries need to do to help themselves get out of the crisis? It is, of course, to a large extent about international assistance, but in terms of mobilizing domestic revenues, in terms of optimizing their own public spending, there's a lot to do. And advanced economies can help by, for example, looking into the international taxation system by combating illicit flows and the laundering of money, perhaps looking at the issue of tax havens again, so that countries do have a chance to raise the revenue that is needed and to help against the widening of inequality, which is one of the more concerning side effects of this crisis. And above all, what we hear from our membership, our executive board has been really fast in approving many programs for, I think, more than 60 countries as of now, within a few weeks only. But the question of how the money is used and the question of governance and governance structures and the fight against corruption has been a very strong kind of signal that we got back from our membership, that we need to make sure that we take care of that, and we have an eye on it, and we help countries improve on that score. And that is also something, again, where parliamentarians can raise the issue, can make sure that the money is properly spent. Otherwise, the whole level of international support may be much less so than if there are questions about the use of this money. So with that, with these 3 points, financing, debt, and policies for sustainable economy going forward, I would like to give the word back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muhleisen. And we just decided to change a little bit the format of this webinar, of this conversation, because we would like to have more time for the parliamentarians to interact, to share the best practices. So we are going to mix the 2 panels that we were planning. So I would like to give the floor to Kirsten Brosban, and she's going to moderate the rest of this conversation. So thank you very much to all, and this has been a wonderful first panel. Thank you for our 3 panelists.
Thank you, Gabriela. And it was a quick decision because we want to make sure, as Gabriela said, that we don't interrupt the Q&A once we start with that. So instead of having 2 separate sessions, now that the time is already moving fast, we want to bring on board Dr. Ghosh. If you're ready, Dr. Ghosh, I would very much like to welcome you as well. Dr. Jayati Ghosh is a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She is leading the Center for Economic Studies and Planning there, and we're so delighted to have you with us. And if I can ask you to give us your presentation now, and then we will have one Q&A session at the end. And for our participants, please note all your questions to our experts as they speak, and be ready to give your comments and questions and best practice ideas after Dr. Ghosh has given her presentation. Dr. Ghosh, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here and part of this, and I'm very honored to have the privilege of speaking to all the parliamentarians across the world. I think a number of important points have already been made by the previous panelists. So I'm just going to take up on some of these, highlighting what I feel are some of the more important issues that have to be addressed both globally and within our own countries. So I think one of the important points was already raised just now by the previous speaker about how some countries have adopted very unconventional macroeconomic policies, very large fiscal expansion accompanied by further loose monetary policies in terms of the central banks buying up all kinds of debt and providing much more liquidity to the system. Unfortunately, this luxury is not available to most developing countries. Most developing countries have actually had very timid fiscal responses, completely inadequate to meet both the health challenge and the economic challenge. So we are faced with a situation where there's a very large discrepancy in the world between some countries, mostly in the advanced economies, and to a lesser extent China and some others, that actually have been able to put in place fairly dramatic fiscal responses, which incorporate the need for increased health spending for the pandemic and monetary policy responses to somehow revive their economies after the pandemic is over. And a very large group of developing countries who either have a very large burden of external debt, as was already mentioned, or are facing dramatic declines in tax revenue and other revenues, and balance of payments constraints because of the economic crisis unleashed by the pandemic, and therefore do not have the fiscal space to undertake either increased health spending or the kind of major fiscal expansion required to counter the demand compression resulting from the lockdowns and other effects. There's another problem that I think hasn't been added. I think Jeff mentioned this, Jeff Sachs mentioned this a little bit earlier. You see, most developing countries are actually on the beginning, we're really in the growing curve of the pandemic. And we're on the growing curve at a point where many of us have already had very, very severe lockdowns. My own country, India, had the most severe draconian lockdown in the world at the very start of the process, but all we did was kick the can down the road. We had a very severe lockdown for 2 months without putting in the public health measures that would be necessary for us to contain the pandemic subsequently. As a result of which, we are now opening up our economies at a time when the disease is spreading virulently and we're getting an explosion in cases. We will very soon, I believe, India certainly will be among the top countries in terms of the incidence of cases. And there's very little sign that this will actually diminish very quickly. So we're facing the extreme public health crisis at a time when the economies have already received a very major bashing. And I think that creates a particular kind of difficulty which perhaps is inadequately recognized. And it means that international solidarity has to recognize this. And it would be very, very useful if parliamentarians, especially in the North, could encourage their leadership and their governments to recognize this need for international solidarity in several ways. I think some of them have already been mentioned, the need for sovereign debt reductions and for some kind of substantial debt relief, because at the moment developing countries are simply going to be unable to repay the debt that is owed them, not just to bilaterals and multilaterals like the IMF, but more particularly the bond market debt and the other commercial debt that is ongoing. The second is a huge issue of sovereign of SDRs is absolutely essential. It's very unfortunate that basically this was opposed by 2 countries in the G20, including my own, unfortunately, and the United States. But it is something that actually has to be on the agenda until such time as we are able to get a major increase in SDR allocation. Those countries that do not need their SDR reserves should really make them available to developing countries. And I would strongly request parliamentarians from the developed world to push for at least making available their unused SDR accounts to developing countries that are facing very, very substantial foreign exchange constraints. There is a major need for enabling more resources to be raised by developing countries. The middle of a crisis, whether it is a health crisis or an economic crisis, is a terrible time to be raising tax rates. And most developing countries actually cannot even think of this right now. But there are ways of generating tax revenue, and eventually all of any fiscal expansion will have to be paid for. Therefore, there are 2 global proposals that are already out there that really need to be pushed. One is that of taxing multinationals at the same rate that local companies get taxed. This is a proposal for unitary taxation, which has been pushed by the International Commission for Reform of International Corporate Taxation. I'm a member of that, but it has also been raised by the G24 and in the OECD BEPS initiative, which is the idea that multinationals will be taxed as if they are a single company by every country, depending on the sales and employment in that country, with a minimum rate, let's say 25%, to be established globally. And this would actually mean that multinationals are taxed at the same rate as domestic companies, which means that their shifting of profits to avoid taxes would actually not be of any use anymore. The second is a global asset registry, and this is to avoid the point that was made earlier about illicit financial flows and about tax evasion by high net worth individuals. And a global asset registry requires the support of all the countries, of course, but it is something that is feasible. Some Scandinavian countries, I think Norway is already attempting this, but it is something that was essential to allow developing countries to actually benefit from being able to tax their own rich individuals, most of whom avoid taxation through a lot of these illicit financial flows. There is a danger, I would argue, which is clearly evident in many of our countries today, developing world in particular. There is a danger that because this pandemic and the lockdowns have led to such a collapse of economic activity, that the pressure will be to somehow generate economic growth at all costs. And that means encouraging brown growth. Already in India, there is a pressure to relax environmental standards, to get into any kind of expansion of economic activity, and to allow companies to do all kinds of things which would not be allowed, to ease the regulations and restrictions, simply to generate GDP growth. We see this actually across the world. We see this in the United States as much as we see it in India. And there is, in fact, a likelihood that global investors will also pressure governments to do this. It's very important for parliamentarians to be aware of this and to prevent that kind of relaxation of regulations and restrictions, which will actually be much worse, not only for combating climate change, but would actually mean that we will never achieve the SDGs. Finally, I just want to get back to SDG 3, the one that is most dramatically impacted by the pandemic. And of course, we all know about how the pandemic itself is eroding the possibility of meeting SDG 3 about health. But there are other ways in which they are doing this. And in particular, other health conditions have been hugely negatively impacted by the pressures to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Reproductive health, major concerns. In India, the number of women who are having to deliver at home, not able to access institutional facilities, has doubled in the last 2 months. And I'm sure this is the case across many other countries in the developing world. Immunization services dramatically declined across the world, and we know what that means in terms of child health and in terms of the future health of the adult population. Polio, measles, a whole range of other diseases will actually be back with us because we are neglecting this critical feature of immunization. The collapse of livelihoods has meant a dramatic increase in poverty and basically an inability to access food. Malnutrition actually exposes people to a host of other diseases. And that is a very serious concern across South Asia, across large parts of Sub-Saharan and North Africa as well. We really have to be worried about the fact that lack of nutrition, lack of access to affordable food is generating massive, declining conditions of material existence, which will expose people to other health problems. And finally, there's the issue of treatment of other diseases, TB, HIV/AIDS, emergencies, health emergencies, cancer treatment. All of these have been delayed, have been kept on hold, have been reduced because of the efforts that especially developing countries are putting in to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. These are very serious health concerns that cannot be ignored, and unfortunately they are being ignored at the moment. I just wanted to raise these as issues that have to be borne in mind when we're discussing the larger impact of these on the pandemic, on the SDGs. The final point I would just like to make is that Jeff mentioned this, that the SDGs will not be met until we deal with the pandemic. But it is also true that a number of these SDGs were not going to be met even before the pandemic struck. It is absolutely critical for the global community, a group like all the international parliamentarians we have here, to be single-mindedly aware of the need to pursue the SDGs and not allow these pressure governments or the way that the flows operate in order to reduce the ability of governments to meet the social and economic rights of citizens or to work towards the SDGs, or the inability to raise the fiscal revenues that are necessary for the required expenditures, or the inability of the international community, including multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, to think of ways of long-term financing that are absolutely essential for the investments that we require to meet SDGs and climate change. We need to keep all of these in focus and not be distracted by the immediate need to address the pandemic, because otherwise we're going to be left with a situation of a very, very desolate and I would say a very extreme global situation in which we will be basically battling crisis after crisis. I think I should stop here. Thank you.